Welcome to the second hour of Kenya's biggest conversation, The Situation Room, with Eric Latif, CT Muga, and Nduoko. And we have a guest in the studio. Before we introduce the guest, CT has the day's proverb.
Chombo cha kuzama hakina usukani.
Chombo cha kuzama hakina usukani. In English?
A sinking vessel needs no navigation.
A sinking vessel needs no navigation. Really?
Destination guaranteed. You're going down.
Bottom.
Wow.
Bottom of the
You'll
ocean.
hit the bottom. There's no ifs and buts. Because the option had been for it to be afloat. Now, once that particular option ceases to be, and it is clear that it is sinking, that's it.
It doesn't matter the expertise of the captain.
It's sinking.
Many years of experience.
It's sinking.
In fact, now we have had somebody who has survived such kind of catastrophes before.
I am glad you mentioned it. There was a ship known as the Titanic. And by all accounts, it was sink-proof. It has been touted as such. And lo and behold, they hadn't informed the iceberg that it hit.
That it was
That it was sink-proof. So when it collided with the iceberg did its thing, stood its ground. The ship also did its thing, tried to go through, didn't manage, and it sank.
I get the feeling that the iceberg had actually been warned. It had read the news. It had read the blogs.
And said, oh, it's like this. Huh?
Really?
That's what you guys are saying.
Ha.
Yes.
Kujeni. Mtu asichange your game. Ikuje vile iko.
Yes.
Playing cards.
And lo and behold. So that's the thing about vessels. If you talk about seafaring vessels, they are built so that they can float on water. The moment they're not floating and they're sinking, believe me, there's nothing else you can do. They'll
Indeed.
just continue sinking. Yes.
Let's introduce our guests in the studio. Journalist Asha Mwilu, award-winning journalist, founder, managing partner at Debunked Media. Good morning.
Morning, Eric.
Good to have you in the Situation Room.
Good to be here.
We call this the hot seat, but because you're one of us, it's not going to be hot. It'll just be warm, you know? Very nice place for you to be. Enjoy yourself. It's familiar environment. You've been on this floor before. You've worked here for many years, right?
The newsroom behind you actually made me. I sat there for close to a decade, practicing journalism, honing my skills. So this is home.
Exactly. And that's what I meant.
So when you go home, you're supposed to feel comfortable.
Yes.
So I don't know anything about hot seats.
No. There's nothing like a hot seat. That's what I said.
Good.
Yeah. So, tell us about Debunked Media. What is it that you do now that you left mainstream newsroom and you went and founded Debunked Media?
Yeah, so Debunk Media is a digital media platform. We are a fully fledged media concern, and we produce multimedia content, primarily journalism, and we target audiences on social media, drive them to our website or to other partners that we work with. So it's a lot to do with innovating around journalism. We know that people are sort of like switching off their TVs and being on their smartphones more. A higher percentage of people across the world and in Kenya are accessing news via social media first before they go on TV. But radio is still king. Let me say that because I'm on radio.
Yeah.
Because it's true.
But it's true, yeah.
So, what kind of content then do you produce?
All kinds. So if you look at our website, you'll see we have what we call the 3 Ps and a D. Initially, Debunk started as a sort of like an explainer platform, and then we morphed into just covering everything. So the 3 Ps are pop culture, politics, people, and then the D is debunked, which is data journalism. So we just like to say that we like to tell good stories because we believe that every society deserves good storytelling. So even if you're giving me a political story, it needs to sound good. It needs to be, I need to enjoy it, right? And so that's what we do. And we are a very diverse team. We're a team of journalists, but we also have filmmakers, we have illustrators, animators, and data scientists. So just trying to approach journalism a bit differently.
Sure. Asha, what's a good story? I mean, there's so many things going on in the country. Even when you're learning, we're told like the tragic news is the good news,
Yeah.
right? Even as we are learning how to report. But and has that changed today as you're looking at what to report, as you're looking at the stories to tell? What makes a good story?
I think the news values will never change. And, they say, learn the rules and then know when and how to break them and for what reason. So I think, you're talking about the fact that when it bleeds, it leads, that perhaps if it's a big event, an impactful event, it's supposed to be a top story. And that is true. For me, I just believe that a good story goes beyond the fluff. A good story helps me make sense of what's going on. And especially now, like the world is really, really changing. So many things are interconnected. So if I can read a good story, enjoy it, feel like there's a little bit of hope at the end. And if there is no hope, I can sort of like make sense of all the chaos. That's what I think a good story is. And one that targets me where I am, that I don't have to dig too deep and I don't have to pay for it.
So let me understand what you're saying, Asha. Are you saying that at the heart of this matter, is it, or let me ask the question rather than make a statement, is it in the content or is it in the ability that someone has to tell a good story?
I think it's in both, right? I think so many times we have storytellers who get a good story, but they just can't tell it, So I think it's in both. I think you need good content. You need to determine what good content is, but you need a good storyteller to tell that story.
I was hoping you'd also say that you need to perhaps also understand your audience and understand what stories they like.
Absolutely. You need to understand the audience. You need to know what types of stories people want to listen to hear, to read. But you also must be able to surprise them. I like a good surprise. I like to go on a site and think, I never thought a story could be told this way, and find that the publisher or the reader has surprised me. So yes, understanding the audience is really amazing, but you should be able to also offer new insights or new ways of enjoying things. It's like going to a new restaurant and feeling like, this is odd, this is different, but I kind of like it.
Asha, do you feel like sometimes mainstream media does not afford the journalists the opportunity to do this as much and as far as they'd like to?
Yeah, absolutely. The way we've modeled mainstream media, it's really to break news, right? And when we go deeper, of course, there's like a resource question to that. But I find that as a journalist working in our newsroom today, the way our newsrooms are set up, there's little room to sort of like take a bit more time with the story, because there's like, it's very deadline driven. It's very conveyor belt driven. So what's the big story? Let's keep it moving. And that's good. I mean, that's good for a young journalist who wants to tell as many stories as possible, who wants to rove the world and break the biggest stories. But for someone who wants to go deeper, I find that the mainstream newsrooms, as they're set up, doesn't accord us enough opportunities for that.
Is it really the setup, or, because look, like you said, many people are now accessing, the first point of access of information is on social media.
Yeah.
And social media is giving you the snippets of what's happening right here, right now. But also, this is the same avenue that you're using to reach your audience with the deep, incisive stories. So those two are still playing out in this same world. Why is it not possible to do the same in the mainstream media?
I don't know, maybe you should tell me. You're in mainstream. Here's the thing. If I'm on social, if I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, and let's look at perhaps like the biggest story that happened yesterday. So Mudavadi has his big event, and I'm following everything that's happening. I mean, I was looking at small snippets. The thing is live on TV.
Yep.
By 9 p.m., what do you want to hear?
The so what?
Exactly. Did we get that? I don't think we did. And that's what I mean when I say the way the newsrooms are set up. We've built our newsrooms to break the big stories, to chase the big stories. But we haven't built them to go deeper and explain the consequences of these things. I mean, I'm looking at the newspaper today, and I've counted, for instance, on the Standard, 6 pages dedicated to the Mudavadi story.
Yeah.
And I mean, I haven't had time to really go deeper into all the articles, but when I just look at the headlines, none of them explain the so what. I don't want to believe that not a single political reporter in Kenya knew that this was happening. You know? I don't want to believe that there's not a single person who could not have had a scoop. When was Ruto and Mudavadi? When were they meeting? You know? What were the intrigues of coming up with this pact? What are the details of their agreement? What does it mean? Is Mudavadi now a running mate? Is Ruto now a running mate? I'd want to know that. When I read the paper, I don't want to know that there was a big event at Bomas of Kenya.
There was drama.
And there was drama, right? And there's a tremor and earthquake. I want to go beyond this flashy headlines into content, into depth, into nuance, you know? I'd want to know, I want to read from someone who was at the event at Bomas and sort of like picked up certain nuances, spoke to certain people, and found out intrigues that I wouldn't have watched on the live show.
But Asha, wouldn't you say, if you look at mainstream media, let's talk about print, that usually follows after the event. Columnists come in, and then you have talk shows on TV where supposed political analysts and experts now do the very thing that you are asking. That seems to, in my mind, to be the trend. But what you say is valid, and it ought to be. It ought to be alongside, yes, earthquake on the Richter scale is around 0 point something. However, what does it mean? Yes, it ought to have followed the story, but it didn't. So what I'm asking is it because we have a way in which these things tend to play out in the media, or is it that somehow it's never been considered as key? That when you're reporting, you also analyze.
Yeah, I mean, we're always talking about innovation in media. We're still following the traditional way of storytelling, which is exactly what you've said. I mean, the newspaper today will talk about the event, and then maybe tomorrow and the following day we'll talk about the what ifs, the so what, the why. But we've been talking about innovation in media since we switched ourselves off during the digital migration. I mean, we've had so much time to adapt, to shift our thinking. If I was an editor in the newsroom, I would have had those political analysts watching the show and analyzing in real time. As it
exactly.
Played out,
yes.
So that then, even the newspaper then has that type of depth. I think it's just about like thinking outside of the box, but also not even thinking outside of the box. What does the audience want? Like, think of yourself as the audience. What do you want to read about today? That's just where I'm coming from. And I'm not saying that I have like all the answers. Even at Debunk, we keep like fighting in the newsroom.
You have all these debates.
We have the debates, right?
Yeah.
How can we do this better?
Sure. I mean, you've been on the beat, Asha, so you get it. I mean, you understand, the rigors of a newsroom and what happens in there, and then what's demanded of you after an event and things. So where do you think the challenge, I mean, we're now talking about today, how things were 5 years ago and how things are currently. What do you think the intricate challenge might be? Having been in that beehive of activity, does it take a monumental shift to then bring about this new innovative journalism that we talk about? Or does it take a little bit of tweaking of what is currently there? What do you think?
I think at the point that we're at, I feel like it would need a shift. I'm very concerned, for instance, that about the brain drain, having been one of the people who covered the last election in this very newsroom, and now I'm not in there, right? So I don't have the opportunity to sort of like pass on that experience of how I covered the last election. I think there's a huge conversation about brain drain. I think if you look around at the people who are going to cover this election, a majority of your reporters have never covered a single election. So you have very green reporters who are going to cover an election without knowing, without the experience, without
the
knowing
support and know-how.
Exactly. So that brain drain is big, because I think the people who've been there, who've walked the talk, would know how to do things differently. Then I think one big gap is, as journalists, we like to talk about data and research and, how this informs the world, but we don't think about it with our own work. I wonder if we have any lessons from the last election as media. What worked, what didn't work. I see the same mistakes. I see people repeating the same mistakes. There was a huge conversation after the last election about which candidates got how much airtime, right?
Yep.
It's the same thing that's happening now. How we covered polling, opinion polls, right before the election. I mean, are you not seeing a similar trend to not just the last election, but the one before in 2013? So we ran a poll, we say this percentage of people now want to vote for Honorable Raila or Honorable Ruto, but we don't give the context of that data. How many people did you poll? All these things, they affect voter perception. They affect public opinion. So when we say that we want to be a very open and independent media, what steps are we taking to do that?
Do you think there's a fundamental understanding or even grasping of the responsibility that lies here? Because, I mean, we call it all the time, fourth estate, etc., etc. But I think that there's a deeper fundamental responsibility sometimes that we don't get, that we have, beyond just informing and educating and entertaining. Just like you're saying here, somebody gives out a poll and we're very excited by the top results, not looking at the underlayers and what it actually portends for country or for this process. Do you think that there is that understanding of the responsibility then to share that for people to understand, or at least to, make meat of?
I don't know. I hope there is. I want to believe that media managers know the responsibility they hold, right? You're running national platforms that influence how the society thinks, how the society responds to certain events. I just think we sometimes give away that responsibility a little bit too easily.
To who?
To many people, to politicians, for instance. I saw a conversation happening online about the agenda setting function of media. Does media set the agenda in Kenya anymore?
Did it ever?
There's a time that we did. I doubt that we're doing that now. Headlines are driven by what politicians will say, what they'll do. We'll give 5 headlines or 4 headlines in a week to a certain coalition building process without really any content, to be honest. It's that these people were spotted together. The what ifs, where's the agenda setting?
There's always striking a balance between, and yes, I agree with everything that you're saying. These conversations are had at various levels in various fora. The Media Owners Association in their meetings will sit down and ask themselves, people, are we leaning too much on one side? Is it okay for us to express our personal opinion as individual investors in the media versus what our independent media house is doing? They have those conversations. Kenya Editors Guild, when they meet, they had a meeting just this weekend. When they meet, they have these conversations of how are we covering our elections? How are we covering our news? What's best, what's not, what worked, what didn't? Those conversations are happening in various fora. The Parliamentary Journalists Association will have, the Health and Science Reporters Association. All these various aspects and places, conversations are taking place. And where I'm seeing the gap then and seeking to understand is then what happens. Is it that after all these conversations we come back and something else then informs the direction that we take? And I dare say that I've heard that answer being given as a yes. And the something else is the audience. What is it that the audience wants? When you had a conversation here with the Standard Group political editor, Rosalie Nobala, we asked the same. She said, you know what? We use data on a daily basis. Every day we look at, so we circulated X number of copies of the paper. And this was the headline. We look at the regions. How was the circulation? What are the numbers? We look online. What are the numbers? of the people who actually clicked on this particular story, and we are able to tell certain headlines will attract readers more than other headlines. That means that this is what the audience wants. If this is what the audience wants to consume, then all these other stories we see it and all, then they'll come into page 3, page 4, page 17, page 18. But the headline will have to be something related to this kind of political conversation.
I mean, I've had that. I agree, but I think it's a very lazy argument, right? This has been the argument even when I was still in the newsroom, that people want to read politics. Of course, it's true. I mean, right now, I'm really concerned about politics. I would want to pick up the newspaper because the headline is a political story. But how many times do you look at the headline, the splash, and you're like, wow, I really want to get into this story. And then you get into the content and it's like, where is the story? How many times has that happened to you? I mean, this happens to me all the time. So it's not a matter of the fact that audiences want to read politics, so we will give them some fluffy pieces. Go deeper. Of course, people want to read politics. It's a political season. Politics controls a lot of what happens in this country. Politics affects our economy. The inflation is high. People don't have money in their pockets. They want to know who the next president will be, how politics is shaping up. But what value are we giving them in the content? Surely, it must go beyond these two men, because that's often the headline. These 2, 3, 4, 5 men are coming together to form a coalition. Or they're talking about this. Or this person has dumped the other one.
So in your opinion, if we were to set the agenda, instead of stating the obvious, what ought we to do? How should we approach this same subject?
I would love to see the media setting the agenda on what this election is about. You know? What should this election be about? Surely the economy. We are struggling, right? So when we talk about the candidates and what they're talking about, how they're forming their coalitions, when they'll launch their manifestos, what is their thinking around the economy? How are they forming the teams? Who's going to inform the sort of policies that they come up with? That ought to be the media's role. You know, the election is not just about who wins or who loses. You know, the election is about where does the country go after 2022?
Yeah.
How do we get out of the debt that we're in? How do we work on our healthcare systems now that COVID has shown us what's happening with our public healthcare system? That ought to be the media's role, I think.
This is Kenya's biggest conversation, the Situation Room, and our guest this morning is journalist Asha Mwilu. She's a founder and managing partner at Debunked Media. And we are looking at, so how are we covering the 2022 general election? And is it different from the kind of coverage that we've received before in the other previous general elections? Is mainstream media playing a role? Are the alternative media outlets like Debunked Media, which is digital, are they giving us a different kind of context and content? Are we getting this from other quarters as well? This is a conversation to have. The coverage of the 2022 general election and what we are seeing so far. So as Debunked Media, Asha, have you had conversations with the aspirants to seek out the other side and also bring out the stories in a different way?
Yeah, we have. So around mid last year, we designed a project because we thought there's so many presidential aspirants, but then we only see the stories of around 4 of them. So we designed this project called the Presidential Series. And the aim of the project was basically to profile all the people who've declared that they want to be president of Kenya. And so and this is the kind of stuff that perhaps we don't have time for in mainstream media, where you do like a long 8,000 word profile of an individual, which is like very deeply nuanced and told in an interesting way. And so we sought out all the candidates and started interviewing them and wrote these profiles. Of course, we are a small platform. We're online and we're still growing. So we wanted to amplify this work. So we got into a partnership with the Star newspaper. And every Wednesday, they dedicated the front page to this project. So every candidate that we would profile then would have a splash on the Wednesday. And then, because of course the paper doesn't have acres and acres of space, they can't run an 8,000 word story, then they would divide the story into 3 parts. So they would run part 1 as a splash on Wednesday, part 2 on Thursday, and then part 3 on Friday. And at Debunked Media, we would just publish the entire profile online. Yeah. So it was it's a very interesting project. It's not ended. We've done 7 profiles where we have 5 left, but of course now there are more people throwing their hat in the ring. When we launched the project, there was no woman who had declared interest, and now we know there's a young woman who wants to run.
Yep.
But I know she doesn't meet the age criteria to run for president in Kenya. I think she's in her early 30s. But something interesting happened when we started doing the interviews. You know, we thought, I mean, of course, someone like Ruben Kigame, for example, who is an aspirant who doesn't really get a lot of airtime. When we went to interview him in Eldoret at his home, it was just very interesting to see who he is. Vis-a-vis how he's been covered by media. You know, I think the media has approached him as this blind musician, to be honest. Like that's been his narrative.
Right.
But you go and you meet this intellectual, right, who knows a lot about the world. He knows about his politics. I think the singing is just it's a part of him. And you really realize how much of an injustice the media has done to him, that we have done to him. And so you read his profile, and people who've interacted with that project, a lot of them say, Ruben Kigame is my favorite, you know?
After reading his story.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think you just need to go to the website, read those profiles.
But what's the reception like? If you look at the numbers, the number of clicks that you get in the articles,
Yeah.
and the kind of feedback that you get after the serialization by the Star, what's the reception like?
The reception is really good. You know, we say that a lot of the content is left for the discerning reader. You really have to get deep and read between the lines. And I think some people have really picked up certain things. The reception was really great. Like on our pages, I told you we're now growing. On our pages, we got a lot of hits. But I think the real impact was actually on the Star, because they had to publish additional copies every Wednesday. They had to think about perhaps printing additional copies in the region where the candidate being featured comes from, because there is this feeling of, oh, look, like representation. Our person is on the front page. And not because of some controversy or because they're forming a coalition with a certain person. It's just their story.
But
is
the
on front
conversations
page.
continue thereafter. So, for instance, once you've covered, one candidate, Ruben Kigame, okay? So he's gotten coverage on Debunked Media and Debunked Media platforms.
Yeah.
He's gotten coverage on the Star. He's also gotten coverage on the other media platforms as well, various interviews. Does the conversation continue? Does the conversation continue to show what is Ruben Kigame's position, for example, on the political parties alliance? What does he think about how to improve universal health care? How does he think about the economy? What does he think about this and the other? Because he is on the campaign trail,
Yeah.
not just once,
Yes.
but on a daily basis. Are we able to sustain a conversation on these other, let me call them smaller candidates, as we are able to with the bigger candidates
It should.
who are in our face?
I think that the conversation should continue. You know, this project for us was, let's get this conversation going. Let's cover as many people as we can, as many people as our resources allow. But I think it's a type of thing, because I think as media we are really used to saying, oh, let's see now where they go with this, right? No, but it's a very collective conversation. Perhaps you guys should have Ruben Kigame on the show,
We have
We've had him several times.
several times.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So let the next TV station pick up
Right.
Ruben Kigame,
You know
and the
what
next radio station.
Something that puzzles me, when indeed, even as I'm looking at the papers and I'm looking at just how we have featured these politicians, is it that they make the effort through their communication teams to reach out? Or is it that we are the ones who follow them up and give them this big story?
You know, you do bring up a really good point. Right now in the age of social media, a lot of candidates can get the eyeballs on them just by being active and by being strategic with their communication. So a part of the conversation is also how these candidates are positioning themselves, how they're branding themselves, right? But then I think as media, and especially as mainstream media, we need to think about what our role is. Let me give you an example. As a candidate who has less resources, what you would call a small fish, is bound to have less media coverage than a big candidate. If you look at the US elections, for example, they have this period called the invisible primary. So in 2015, in the lead up to the primaries, Trump, who was a less known candidate, quote unquote, in terms of his politics, he got the most media coverage in the US. In fact, a Harvard study showed that the US mainstream media, 8 outlets to be specific, gave him about $55 million worth of advertising. And that was just like free coverage. That made Trump so popular when it came to the primaries. He had really risen up the ranks. If you look at the Kenyan context, what you would call maybe the invisible primaries for us, this is usually 1 year before the nomination process. This has been the past year. Who's gotten the most press? Because what happens is that by the time you get into the nomination stage, the more popular candidates, the one who've been covered by the media the most, then have really risen up to the top and have better chances at the primaries.
But also, it's because that person is serious. They're serious and very serious in their quest, and they're investing in their quest to be president. The same way you've said. Why is somebody getting all this coverage? They're getting the coverage because they are producing content. They are a source of content on a regular basis. They're not appearing once in a while, once in 2 weeks, to say something and then they disappear, go back to their shamba, and then they'll come back again after a month.
Plus
If
making
you're
themselves
constantly,
available.
if you're invested in your presidential campaign, you will obviously be out there. If you're invested in the presidential campaign, you'll have raised the resources that are needed to campaign nationally. You can't just sit back and say, oh, media need to give me coverage. They need to come and look for me at my home and ask me on this. Whenever they ask Raila about whether BBI is good, they should also come and ask me for my side of the story. No, do the job.
I agree with you, Latif, by the way. I don't think that we have one pill as the solution. I agree with you. Like, candidates need to put themselves out there. But as media, we need to think about balance. If we're guided by the same news values like impact, we need to think about the news value that is balance. How often do I have this person on my front page? How often do I have them as the top story? And if they do, if you have as much resources as some of the top candidates have, then you get to control the headlines. Is that what we're saying?
Yes.
It's a good discussion when you're talking about the media in, say, Kenya. But if you are talking about the West, say America that you've mentioned, or the UK, where media houses take sides, from the get-go that these people support these values and they support these political principles. So, in such a case, where would the balance be?
But they've declared, right?
Yes, they've declared. It's known.
Can we talk about the Kenyan media, for instance? Which media house supports who? Is a big question.
There's no media house that has openly declared and said, this is our stand and this is the direction we've taken.
Right. What about media owners?
Media owners, there's one who's come out to declare.
Those that we know of, right?
Yes.
I think
Others are media owners and they are also running campaigns. So you own a local radio station and you're running a campaign. So clear.
And also remember, there are media houses that have been associated with a certain leaning.
Yes.
Okay? Now, who is it that has associated them with that leaning? In Kenya, politicians shout very loudly when things don't favor them. Okay? When they get publicity, it's okay. The moment somebody else gets publicity and it isn't them, then it isn't okay.
it's true.
And suddenly the person is being biased.
And that media is then biased.
Yes. And
That's
that
true.
media is then favoring,
So and so.
yes, as opposed to. And yet, there is a certain reality that Eric has mentioned about politics. Let's look at it as a competition. Now, surely, if you're in a competition, should you not be prepared for it?
You should be.
Yes. If you are running an 800-meter race and you are training for 200 meters, what do you think is going to happen to you? We'll see you doing brilliantly in the 200 meter and then you fade away.
What I'm wondering is, have we resigned to the fact that as media, we can be rented by the person with the most resources?
You've changed the
I'm actually
conversation.
no.
That's just a question that I have.
I hear what you're asking, but here's the thing: the headlines that you see in the papers are not bought headlines.
They're not.
All right, you will not go to the official records of that certain media house and ask, so how much has Raila now paid? Bought advertising for? They haven't. Unless an event like yesterday's where it's a paid up advertising, we're giving you live coverage, you pay for it. The rest, you don't. Why are you appearing? It's because you are present. It's the same thing. We cannot say that I am running a newsroom, I'm editor of a newsroom, I'm looking at, so who's available? I have got to go and start digging and looking for what this candidate represents. What does this candidate mean? If the candidate themselves are not actively doing it.
But Eric,
it
that's
is
our
their
role
job.
as the media.
But it's the job of the candidate to actually come out. If the candidate came out today and they made their declaration, they'll get coverage of the declaration. I am declaring I want to be president. But then you look at, in the run-up to this declaration, was this person there? Because there's a track record.
Eric, can we
Was
ask
this
you-
person visible?
Can we ask
After
this-
this declaration, have you seen this person, or do I have to go look for him? Okay, but wait, you told us that you want to be president. Now,
Are you still in-
Okay, can I ask a question? Kindly. I think that's a very interesting argument. Let's even put politics aside and look at another issue that
Yep.
media should be covering. I think one of the TV stations covered this story yesterday. There's drought in parts of the country,
Yes.
northern Kenya.
Yes.
We haven't really seen this story, right? We haven't seen it on social media. So will our argument then be, those people dying of hunger are not really visible. Make noise on social so that media can cover you. The role of the media is to seek out the stories.
Yes.
It's to create that fairness within society.
Yes.
And I think we need to be aware of the inequalities that are present. For instance, women candidates, women politicians have less resources. They get less support from their political parties than men. Data has shown us this. And even the most prolific of them, the ones that you would call the top female politicians. Last election, for instance, I covered 5 of them. I did a documentary for KTN. It's called Against the Grain. And I covered 5 of who you would call women politicians who are mostly on media.
Yeah.
So I covered Martha Karua, Millie Odhiambo, Rachel Shebesh, Lesuda Naisula, and Esther Passaris. And I went to where they were campaigning, like kwa grassroots, And I saw some of the challenges that they're facing. Spoke to them about how much support they get from their political parties. You do see the disparities.
Yes.
And so if media then sits back and says, as a candidate, I need to see you more visible, you need to have more resources for me to pay attention to you, then what we're doing is just creating a bigger, a bigger gap.
My argument, Aisha, is the media is open. There's no financial barrier that has been placed on covering these candidates. No one has said that if you're a candidate and you're vying, you have to pay X amount of money for you to appear on the Standard, for you to be covered on KTN, for you to be on Spice. So if we are accessible, it's you to access us. As much as we're also looking for you, but also be available, be accessible, and reach out and say, so this is what I'm planning, this is what I'm saying, this is my position on this. If you're constantly in my face, you're going to get coverage.
Eric,
If
I
you're
agree.
not-
I agree with that, right? I agree. Candidates do need to put themselves out there.
Sure.
They need to market themselves. But we can't be the armchair journalists who say, I'm going to sit here and wait for the people who will come and ask me for coverage.
It is true. I said you'd change the topic, and you had, and it is a good thing that you did. You see, if we were to continue with that vein of changing the topic, then I would ask you this. Do we have candidates who have presented themselves to the media and have been ignored? Do we have candidates who have announced that they are having some sort of, what do they call, the unveiling of, yes,
Launch.
That's the word I was looking for. And the media has ignored them. Do we have perennial cases such as this? You see, if one could point to even just 2, then we would say the media is being unfair and the media is biased. But the media does cover. Now, you are a journalist. On any given day, politics aside, how many things are fighting for the attention of media houses on any given day?
For space.
Yes, how many things on any given day? Now, you talk about Northern Kenya. We talk about them here daily. Not just them, that the war-torn areas where they are bandits, some say they are Al-Shabaab. We talk about it on a daily basis here. Now, part of it is to get people interested in knowing that these things are still going
occurring.
on.
Yeah.
But there's a reality about this country and the things that interest them. The problems that were in Pokot, that were in Baringo, that were in Laikipia 2 years ago are the same problems we are still talking about.
True.
Drought aside. As for drought, we know well in advance that it's impeding, it's on its way. And we keep talking about it. There's a problem. There's a threshold beyond which people do not want to hear bad news. So you will present it, but they'll say, okay. Politics, unfortunately, tends to be more entertaining.
I agree, Charles. Again, here's the thing. Like, I'm not an advocate for any specific candidate. That's not my role. I think for me, what I'm saying is we need to be a bit more reflective as media. And it's not an us versus them conversation, right? I'm part of media as well. If people do not want to read the bad news, I think the solution should not be that we're not going to report on these issues anymore. I think it's to reflect on why is our society at this point. And it's not just drought. There are many other things that are happening, right? We have so much. I mean, mental health, for instance, is a huge crisis in this country. We're always seeing these top stories of someone has killed their wife, their kids. I think it's how do we make these things make sense, Do we place a big political story on a headline every day and forget about everything else that's happening? Because people don't want to read about these things, so let's wish them away and not put them on the front page.
Actually, I'm of the view that even if they don't want to listen to it, can we find a way in which we can make it interesting so that they pay attention to it?
That's what I was saying about the agenda-setting role of the media. How do we tell our society, hold on, I know we have an election, I know there's these big coalitions being formed, but against that backdrop, there's these other things that are also happening.
Actually, it's not a but. It's actually saying that these are the issues that are affecting us today as a country. And these are the issues upon which we should judge the aspirants when they come to us. What is your position when it comes to issues of food security?
Absolutely.
Because you have acute food insecurity in the country every year. What's your position when it comes to healthcare? Because healthcare is the one thing that is impoverishing Kenyans on a daily basis. If I agree with what you're saying in terms of highlighting the issues at all times versus what this political rhetoric is and the games and the dancing and the shaking of hands and the announcements of coalitions and earthquakes and all. On that, we are.
Do you think it can
completely on the same
change from
page.
what we see, Asha? If we are looking at these issues on a regular and then setting that agenda, do you think then even the things that we're looking at and hoping that would be from this election, that people are making then choices based on issues that have been addressed? If we're looking at a state of the economy that is, in the doldrums, etc., if these issues are being covered from the mouths of these individuals who say they want to be in these positions, do you think then that we can see now a different decision-making process from?
That's what we need to empower the voter. We need to empower the ordinary mwananchi to start thinking of politics in that way. Denmark, for example, in their last election, the party that they voted in was actually on a climate change agenda, because the citizens felt that this is what is most important to us. And now you see even their foreign policy really shifting. Denmark is now, it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And now they're thinking about channeling, and they are doing it. They're channeling most of their funding, foreign funding, towards climate change activities, policies. Can we get to that point as Kenya, where I want to hear what William Ruto stands for, and not just a catchphrase, bottoms up or whatever. Like, what really is your
Bottom. It's
agenda?
bottom.
Oh, it's bottoms up.
Bottom.
It's bottom.
One.
Bottom
It's
up.
one. Or bottom up. Or the S is the one that created the problem.
Right.
But yeah, so what platform is he running on?
Yeah.
You know, and the other politicians.
The others as well.
Even the ones that we're saying we need to hear from more, you know, even though you're just a small candidate, you need to tell us, what is your platform? You know, is it economy? Is it healthcare? Is it...
That's true.
Exactly. So that's the argument.
Very good points that you've brought to the fore today, Asha. Thank you for joining us, and we welcome you again. As we go into this heavy season, let's work together as well with Debunked Media, right?
Absolutely.
We are open to that.
We're
Wanjani
big on
says,
collaboration.
You know, my comment, media is lit business. And Jimmy says we should give you another cup of tea because your points are right up there. Totally on point. Thank you for tuning in. Good morning.